Hi, thanks for joining this webinar with the League of Women Voters of Oregon, League of Women Voters of Lane County, League of Women Voters of Umpqua Valley, and perhaps others. Also the Eugene Springfield NAACP, thank you, and other organizations. And we're here to learn more about proposed redistricting reform for Oregon. I'm Kelly Osborne. I'm with the League for Lane County. We're going to do some introductions, try to orient ourselves to the format for the evening, and then we'll get into the presentation. I just want to pause for a moment to note that in this time of the COVID-19 pandemic, we're meeting in virtual space. So while we may be physically distanced, we're socially connected, and our social connections matter more than ever. And that's the only way we're going to be able to deal with the economic, civic, and health consequences of this pandemic. We also want to acknowledge that although we're coming from different places for this event, many of us here in this space live on the traditional land of the Kalapuya people, whose descendants are citizens of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians of Oregon. And we honor with gratitude the land and the people who've stewarded it. And we reaffirm our commitment to right stewardship through our work. And this is part of that work too. This is part of our stewardship work. So you should be able to see some folks on the screen, and those include Candalyn Johnson and Norman Turrell with the League of Women Voters of Oregon. Also Eric Richardson with the Eugene Springfield NAACP. And behind the scenes, I just want to shout out Amanda Crittenden, who's all staff person with the League of Women Voters of Oregon, who is essential to making these things work. So talking just a little bit about how the format's going to go, where to make sure that everyone can hear us, everyone participating will be muted until it's time to ask a question directly. So we expect that as the presentations happen, many of your questions will be answered. And so if we don't get to your question right away, we may be able to address it through the presentation, but we will get to you later. And we appreciate your patience. And so if you want to pose a question, there are 3 ways you can do that. If you scroll your mouse to hover over the bottom of your screen, and we know some screens work differently, but ideally if you do that, over the bottom of your screen, you'll see options for Q&A, chat, or raise hand. If you'd like to ask a question live where you can speak to the panel and guests verbally during the Q&A portion of the meeting later, you can use the raise hand feature. If you want to ask a question, but you don't want to ask it live during the meeting, using the Q&A feature will allow us to see your question and we can pose it for you. And then you can do the same thing with the chat feature. And enter something there. And if you have questions or run into technical issues, make a note there. And please forgive us. We're going to screw this up, and that's going to have to be okay. We're still going to get a lot of really good information out there. Anything you want to add, Candalyn, just about how we want to manage the space?
Yeah, so if you're using the webinar chat feature instead of the Q&A feature, one thing to note is when it says to all panelists or all panelists and attendees. If you want to make a comment just to the folks who are running this that you can see, that would be the people at the top of your screen in the gallery view, then you would just check all panelists. But if you're maybe asking a question and you want others, all of the attendees to know you're asking a question, you want to make sure that you check all panelists and attendees so that everyone can see your question. The other thing is when you click Q&A, it'll say open. I can see it as open, answered, and dismissed. So at the end of the presentation, Norman and I will be answering a lot of the questions in the Q&A and the chat, and we'll probably answer most of them live. But if at any time you want to actually ask your question live, I would use the raise hand feature or let us know that, hey, or if we ask a question, we try to answer your question, but you're like, I need to clarify that. They didn't understand my question, right? That'll be a chance where Amanda will actually unmute you, but there'll be a little pop-up that actually asks you to unmute yourself. So that's kind of what that'll look like when it's your turn to talk. I think that's a lot of it. I think we can go ahead and go into introductions. So I'll go ahead and introduce myself first. So hi everyone, my name's Candlin, and I've been with the League since August of 2018 working on redistricting efforts in Oregon. And we started out doing public forums across the state to educate voters on the issue, get their input. And then we formed a statewide coalition called People Not Politicians. We joined that coalition and we decided we wanted to get redistricting reform on the ballot in November. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, is where that's at and how you can ensure redistricting reform is on the ballot, but also a little bit of history, right? Redistricting is a complex issue, so it's nice to get a little bit of background of how it works and what are some things that are currently happening in the state and what is this proposal trying to fix. So that's what we're going to be going over today. We've got lots of guests from People Not Politicians here to introduce themselves and what they're doing for this effort. So I want to give them some space to talk. So first, let's go ahead and Norman from People Not Politicians. He's also the chair of the LWVOR advocacy. So Norman, why don't you go ahead and talk about why the League supports redistricting reform and why we joined People Not Politicians?
Well, first I'll say that I've been a longtime League member, so long that I can't remember when it was that I joined, sometime back in the 70s, but have joined the League leadership starting in the 1990s and progressed all the way up to being a national board member, and now am a governance coordinator for the Oregon League. And I'm also the chair of the People Not Politicians campaign and chief petitioner of the Initiative 57, as well as the chief drafter of that initiative. So I know something about this. Why we're doing this is that the legislature has consistently failed over the last 100 years to redistrict the state. The last time it actually passed something was in the 1980s, and it even that had to be appealed to the Oregon Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ordered the Secretary of State to correct the redistricting. So the legislature also has a conflict of interest with the whole process. They're essentially choosing their voters instead of the voters choosing them, and so we want to change that system. We can't claim that we have the best way of redistricting the state, but I think we have a better system that we're proposing than what the legislature does. And it will be a lot more open and accountable and equitable for everybody concerned. So I'll stop there, and we'll see what questions you have later. I'll introduce Eric Richardson with the NAACP. Welcome, Eric. You gotta unmute, Eric. Still muted. There.
There you are. So thank you, Norm. Yeah, so my name's Eric Richardson. I've been with the Eugene Springfield NAACP as president since 2013. And the last year, I have transitioned into the newly formed executive director position for the branch. The NAACP has been in Eugene since 1976, and as you know, we have a strong history with voting rights in the United States, and so we are always interested whenever these issues come up. And in these times, the NAACP wants to make a principled stand that can be heard nationwide. And I think Oregon in some ways has the opportunity to do those things. And so I'm just happy to be here with you guys today, and hope you have a good conversation.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Eric. And Eric's been a really awesome leader in People Not Politicians. He's a part of our executive committee and has really been a part of our of the People Not Politicians daily campaign decisions. It's been really awesome having NAACP on board. So I wanted to thank Eric for that and for joining us today. Eric, just quickly, I don't know if you have the link or anything you could share with our attendees of where they can go to learn more information. I'd love if you, before you left, if you were going to leave today, leave your website or some way for people to learn how they can get involved in the chat.
Right. I guess I could chat that information to everyone.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now with you all. I have a presentation that will kind of go over what we're going to be talking about today. So let me do that. And then I need to do this. There we go. Okay, so People Not Politicians has really been a fascinating coalition to be a part of. What I like to say is that you, for the first time since probably before 2016, you have people who don't really agree on anything, agreeing that redistricting should be fair, should be transparent, and that redistricting should be for voters. And so that's something that's been really awesome for about People Not Politicians, is just how broad and diverse and statewide it is. We've really come together from all party affiliations, backgrounds, to talk about equal, fair, transparent representation for the state and congressional level. The other thing I wanted to point out, and the reason why this is a really important time for redistricting reform, is because based on the 2020 census, we are likely to receive a 6th congressional district member, which it would be a U.S. congressional seat, and that's super exciting. But it also means that we'll be changing the way that district lines have been drawn for several decades. And so it's really important that we ensure that this process is fair when we're already going to be seeing a lot of that change happening in Oregon next year. We want Oregon voters to be choosing their politicians. Politicians should not be choosing their voters. So I want to go ahead and just quickly go over a few things. The first is the current system in Oregon. So every 10 years, the US Census requires that states redraw legislative and congressional election districts to account for population changes. So currently, these districts in Oregon are drawn by legislators and are subject to a veto by the governor. When the legislature can't decide on a map by the deadline, or the governor vetoes the plan, the responsibility shifts to the Secretary of State for the legislative maps and to the Oregon Supreme Court for the congressional maps. So there's like a split of duties there. If there are challenges to the maps, which there almost always are, the courts take over the process to review and approve the maps. So the process for drawing congressional legislative district boundaries has for far too long been controlled by politicians in Oregon. Letting politicians manipulate voting maps is like putting the fox in charge of the hen house. Politicians in power shouldn't be allowed to draw voting maps that benefit themselves or their party, but that's exactly what they can do now in Oregon. So one of the main things that happens when legislators can draw their own districts is gerrymandering. And I really love this graphic because we hear the word gerrymandering all the time, but it's kind of hard to think about how it's actually implemented by those in charge of the redistricting process. And I think this graphic does a pretty good job of actually showing you how you as a legislator could gerrymander districts to give your party or yourself as an incumbent an advantage in an election. So as a quick run through, gerrymandering is when elected or appointed officials in charge of redistricting draw districts in a way that make elections uncompetitive. They create things called safe districts where incumbents are just guaranteed to win, and they give a clear advantage and secure incumbency. So there are two ways that gerrymandering is often implemented. The first is the second example, which is called cracking. And that is when if the majority party in a state gets control of redistricting, will crack minority votes into as many districts as possible. So that's how you can see the blue one, all of the districts here, all 5, and red one, none. And this is when you can get voters in districts that feel like their vote doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if they go out to vote because they're never going to be able to change their representation. And we don't like that at the league, right? So the second most common way that gerrymandering is implemented is called stacking. And this is actually how the minority party, if they get control of redistricting, could end up with more seats than the majority party if they stack the majority of voters into as little amount of districts as possible. So that's where you can see a lot of blue in 2 of the districts and only a few blue in those 3 other ones, so that the red party in that example, number 3, can get as many districts as possible. The last thing that I want to challenge is just the first example of perfect representation. There's one really big glaring problem with this, and that is that these districts are highly uncompetitive. So these would be safe districts. If a red candidate ran for that red district, they would win. This could be a really good example of bipartisan gerrymandering, where both parties got together in a room behind closed doors and negotiated as many safe districts as possible. So one way nationally that gerrymandering can be measured is through the efficiency gap. And the efficiency gap and gerrymandering has been made a lot easier actually by the use of technology. There has gotten to a point where you can actually draw lines through houses, through streets. There have been lines drawn directly between dorm rooms, right? And so gerrymandering can be very, very, very detailed. The value of the efficiency gap, a metric developed in 2015 by academics Nicholas Stephanopoulos and Eric McGee, is an important tool, just one tool that's used to measure gerrymandering. The Brennan Center for Justice's Eric Petrie explains that the efficiency gap counts the number of votes each party wastes in an election to determine whether either party enjoyed a systematic advantage in winning and turning votes into seats. So Oregon typically isn't considered one of the states in the country that has the worst gerrymandering problem. And I agree with you. We don't have the worst gerrymandering problem in the country, but the state does have an 18.9% efficiency gap advantage for the Democrats, which does actually give us 1 extra Democratic congressional seat. And according to this is according to the data analysis social activism outfit Azavio, which is where this graphic is from. Some reformers say that the efficiency gap should be kept at or below 7. Oregon actually, if you see here, has the 4th strongest efficiency gap advantage favoring Democrats and ranks 11th overall in the country. Oops. So the other thing I want to mention is what's being done across the nation, because gerrymandering is a national issue. Although People Not Politicians campaign is based in Oregon, it is important to note that leagues across the country are working on redistricting reform, and we are just a part of a larger national effort to end gerrymandering and fight for every vote to matter. In June of 2019, the US Supreme Court left the fight for redistricting to the states, and so it's up to Oregonians to protect Oregonians from partisan gerrymandering. The People-Powered Fair Maps national program was launched by the League of Women Voters of the United States in September of 2019 to create fair and transparent people-powered redistricting processes that eliminate partisan and racial gerrymandering nationwide. So the League of Women Voters of the United States is working with each league to ensure fair political maps are designed with communities in mind. We really recognize that redistricting is a political process, but the process fails when it's used to silence the voice of underrepresented communities. As recently as 2018, 5 other states actually passed redistricting reform measures on their ballot, and that would be Colorado, Michigan, Missouri, Ohio, and Utah. So as you can see here, pretty much every state is going through some type of reform process for redistricting. So let's talk a little bit about how redistricting has gone down in history. Norman briefly mentioned it, but I want to make sure you all know what is happening. How is the legislature actually drawing districts here in Oregon? So according to the 2012 City Club of Portland study, prior to the Oregon legislature's success in 2011, 1981 was the last time the legislature successfully passed a redistricting plan, but following a lawsuit, the plan was later modified by the Secretary of State. So before 2011, the last time the Oregon legislature successfully passed a redistricting plan that became the final plan was 1911, which means in 100 years, the legislature failed to pass a redistricting plan, often due to partisan differences. And in the case of 2011, Oregon had a bipartisan committee and a House that was evenly divided by Senate leadership and valued bipartisanship. Republicans backed off their insistence that Multnomah County be one district, but the final plan allowed for districts 1 and 5 to become more Republican. Republicans were particularly motivated to compromise because the Secretary of State at the time was Democrat Kate Brown. So the result was a bipartisan gerrymander of the state where each party limited negotiations and could keep their districts. Opposition of this reform, of people not politicians reform, often uses the success of 2011 as an argument as to why we don't need reform in Oregon. But according to a study done by Ballotpedia on the competitiveness of elections held after the redistricting session in 2011, we actually had a net loss of 3 competitive elections. Following several cycles of redistricting plans drawn by the Secretary of State or the Oregon Supreme Court, we really see 2011 as a unique cycle, and we don't think that it could be easily repeated by the legislature. It's also important to note that the Legislative Redistricting Committee is not required to be bipartisan at all and could end up having more partisan representation of one party than another during the next redistricting session. So let's quickly go over the current process problems. Our current legislative model allows space for abuse, such as majority party legislators drawing lines to their advantage and to the disadvantage of minority and third party candidates. Leadership of the majority party can use the redistricting process to reward or punish rank and file members of both parties. Despite recent advances, Oregon communities of color are underrepresented by elected representatives that share their lived experiences. Major parties are incentivized to work together to protect incumbents over interests of third parties, minority communities, and outside candidates. And lastly, partisan conflict in a split legislature and/or executive can lead to an inefficient process or a failure to pass maps by deadlines. We need reform now because politicians have an inherent conflict of interest in the redistricting process. Maps drawn to protect incumbents are less likely if non-legislators are the ones that draw district lines. If a commission is multi-partisan in membership, then partisan, bipartisan, and incumbent protecting gerrymanders are less likely, and independence of a commission keeps redistricting from becoming a bargaining chip in the overall legislative process. We also know that voters can't hold their representatives accountable if politicians are choosing who their voters are. So the People Not Politicians campaign is proposing an independent commission to draw district lines, both legislative and congressional. But before I go into the proposal, I just want to make sure that we all have a clear definition of what an independent commission is, because a lot of people will try to fool you. And there is a very strict definition of what qualifies as an independent commission. So there's 2 really key questions that you need to ask when someone says we need an independent redistricting commission. The first is, how are the members selected? Are they selected by an independent entity, or are they appointed by legislators? How is this decision made to adopt the final plan? Does the commission even have the final say? Are they multi-partisan? Are they bipartisan? Those are some of the things that you need to think about. An independent commission is composed of individuals who are neither legislators nor other public officials, and who are selected after a screening process done by another independent entity. Legislators may not serve on the commission or the independent entity in order for it to be qualified as an independent commission. So this reform was created by the statewide coalition and is following the successful 2010 California model. Our proposal has been seen as one of the strongest legally sound reforms in the country by redistricting reform advocates, and so far gone through the court process with little to no hiccups here in Oregon. We know through polling that Oregonians support reform, and we also have seen through the initiative process that we have a strong measure. To enact reform, we would need to make a constitutional amendment, which is why we have an initiative petition. So let's talk a little bit about how the commission would be ran. So to ensure a fair, independent commission, people with conflicts of interest need to be taken out of the pool of applicants. The panel of administrative law judges, who makes up that independent entity that I was talking to you about, would be the one that selects the commissioners and any staff of agencies tasked with supporting the commission. To qualify to be on the commission, you would need to be an individual who is registered to vote in the state for the 3 years preceding the initiation of the application process, have been registered in Oregon with the same political party or unaffiliated with the political party, and have voted in at least 2 of the 3 recent general elections, or have been a resident of Oregon for at least the previous 3 years. Major donors to political candidates or parties would not be eligible to sit on the commission. Neither would elected officials, political party officials, or their family members. Commissioners would be selected to represent the broad diversity of Oregonians and would be required to follow strict criteria when drawing maps. So this is a little bit more when I'll follow up with you all afterwards. I have a PDF that's a little bigger and goes into a little more detail about all of the of a great summary of the entire measure, but this is just a snapshot of that PDF. So the Secretary of State shall provide staff and office support to the commission and the commission staff as needed. Oregonians apply to serve on the commission. It would amend the Oregon State Constitution. The applicant review panel, made up of administrative law judge finalists, would put the finalists into 3 pools. So as you can see here, there's a little filter. The review panel nominates 150 finalists. And even though it says Democrat, Republican, and other, it's important to know that in the actual measure, it's listed as largest political party, second largest political party, and third largest. So that's how that's a little bit different there, but it could change if one party ends up getting more voters than another party. As of right now, the largest political party would be Democrats, second largest would be Republican, and the 50 other would be unaffiliated voters, or it could also be third party voters or the independent party. There would be 12 Oregonians who sit on the commission. There would be 4 from each of those pools. Maps drawn would be adopted by the majority, so it has to be a multi-partisan decision with at least 1 person from each of those pools voting on the final map in order for it to pass. So it has to be a multi-partisan decision. And 10 public hearings have to be held across the state to get public input on the maps before they're passed, with at least 1 of those public hearings held in each congressional district. Some of the criteria, they're actually going to be following a lot of the same criteria that's set through federal and state law currently. So some of the federal requirements would apply where, for instance, borders would be drawn with respect to geographic and voter diversity, reflecting city, county, or other natural boundaries, such as language, racial, or other communities of interest. And favoritism or discrimination against any political party or office holder would be prohibited. We would just include additional requirements added to the Oregon statutes that already exist, where to the extent practicable, redistricting maps should be designed in a manner that achieves competitiveness. We want to increase transparency and public participation in the process by having full participation and allowing the public to attend meetings, provide input and comments on the mapping process. All work and data of the commission will be public record. Multi-partisan and majority voted commissioners is required for maps to be passed. We want to prevent partisan legislators, special interest lobbyists, party leaders, and political strategists and staff from influencing the redistricting process. We want to create positive impact for Oregonians by creating balanced leadership focused on equal representation by elected officials, greater opportunity for underrepresented communities like low-income Oregonians, persons of color, rural Oregonians, and seniors to elect representatives of their choice, better geographic, social, economic, community, and political diversity of elected officials, and elect legislators who are more representative of their district, with an incentive to work effectively to enact policy that all Oregonians want. So now for the fun stuff. How can we actually make this happen in Oregon? So the campaign is working really hard with voters during this public health crisis. We can't be on the streets right now in a lot of places still. And even if we can, it's still a little unsafe because there's a lot of that contact happening. We are going to try in some places eventually when phases start opening enough. But for now, we really need to prioritize Oregonians' health, and that's our main priority. So what we're doing is we're mailing petitions directly to households and offering petitions online. So to get a single line petition, you just need to go to the People Not Politicians website and click sign the petition and follow the instructions. It's really, really easy. If you don't have a printer, you can email sign@People Not Politicians Oregon and you'll get a petition mailed to you. You also could request whether you want just a single line, a 5-line, or a 10-line. If, for instance, you have more than one voter in your household, or maybe you want to leave a clipboard on your neighbor's door. It's important to remember if you are printing out and completing a petition to mail in that you're both the signer and the petition circulator, which is really weird because you're used to someone else being the petition circulator. So that just means that you'll be signing and dating an extra line. There are 2 ways to ensure your petition gets counted. The first is just to mail it to the People Not Politicians P.O. box, and I will be sending this PowerPoint to you all and more information, the website, a lot of this after the webinar today so that you have it. But the P.O. box is P.O. Box 3226, Salem, Oregon. You can also just email the campaign at that same email, sign at, and a campaign volunteer can direct you through the process and help you get your petition signed and in the mail. So what's next? I know that together we can create lasting change and ensure our democracy realizes its promise of one person, one vote. How you can get involved if you want to is to visit the People Not Politicians website to learn more information about how you can sign, how you could help others sign, to join the coalition, or to learn more about the campaign. Just visit www.peoplenotpoliticiansoregon.com. You can join your local league today, and Kelly is your local league leader in the Springfield, Eugene area. I know we have Jenny from Umpqua on today. I saw her. If for some reason you don't know who your local league leader is and you would like to, go ahead and email me back when I send a follow-up email with you today, and I will tell you who your local league leader is. You can also help others find how to sign the petition. This is a really weird time and people want to get involved but don't really know how, so share the information. And you can like, follow, and share the People Powered Fair Maps campaign and the League of Women Voters of Oregon on social media. We really believe that Oregonians want and deserve a fair process. I know Amanda, if you all want, she's going to leave a link in the chat of how you can sign up for the League of Women Voters of Oregon email list so that you can get updates about the campaign. You can also email me back and say, hey, make sure I'm on the email list, but that link will give you a direct access to joining our mailing list. So thank you all for listening to me and taking the time. I'm hoping that some of this was repeat, but it's always good to get a recap of what's going on. Norman and I will go ahead and answer your questions. It looks like some people were using the chat and the Q&A, which I couldn't see because I was sharing my screen. So I'll go ahead and unshare my screen now and we can start answering questions.
Can I throw a few questions at you?
Sure.
Okay. One is, how many signatures do we need total for this drive and by what date?
Yes, great question. So the exact answer is 149,360. I have it memorized now. By the yes, by the July 2nd. Of course, we need to collect more than that because a certain percentage of signatures are going to be invalid. People are going to forget to sign a certain line. People are going to forget to date. They're not going to date correctly, which is why when we are mailing petitions, we're going to have these really clear instructions to try and help people out. And we have an email to help walk people through the process as well. So We're saying that we'd like to collect probably 200,000 to be safe, I would say. Is that about right, Norman?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Another question, are you able to speak at all about the recently changed laws in Colorado, Utah, Michigan, and other states, how they've rolled out, and has it made a difference? Or is it too soon to say?
It's too soon to say for everyone but California. So their first redistricting process is going to be next year, just like ours, because redistricting is done every 10 years. So we'll be able to see how a lot of them do, and the data of how much more competitive or representative their districts are after their redistricting sessions are done in 2021. What we can say is that there have been studies of the redistricting session with California's Independent Redistricting Commission back in 2011, and their districts have been seen to be more competitive and more representative.
Norman saw one of the questions that came in. Do you want to?
Why don't you go ahead and read that and I'll answer it.
Okay. I previously submitted a question that challenged the wisdom of pursuing this redistricting initiative on a state by state rather than a federal constitutional amendment, rather than through that process. As noted in a New York Times article published today, for example, Republicans in Missouri are already working to invalidate the initiative approved by voters in that state. So state by state versus a federal approach.
So there's several parts to this answer. The first part is that the federal U.S. Constitution gives every state control of their own election processes. And redistricting is considered part of that election process. And so it has to be state by state. The next part of this is it's extremely difficult to amend the U.S. Constitution. Witness the efforts to abolish the Electoral College or pass the Equal Rights Amendment and so on. Unless everybody is in agreement on it like they were with the 18-year-old vote, it's not going to happen. And this is another thing that is not going to happen at the federal level. So the other next part of the answer is that actually Republicans also support this reform. It's actually legislators, either Republican or Democrats, that are generally against this. And you can see that in the example that you cited in Missouri. It's the Missouri legislature that's trying to put on the ballot a repeal measure. And the same thing's actually going on in Colorado. There's an initiative being pushed by the powers that be in Colorado that will repeal the effort that they have there. And in my humble opinion, both of those are likely to fail when they get to the voters. So the voters understand the importance of this issue, that gerrymandering is bad, and they will pass whatever they can to change the system of legislators choosing their voters. Then another part of the answer is that the League of Women Voters, among others, is working now in every state to reform the redistricting process. They have a campaign that is called People Powered Fair Maps, that the Oregon League is part of this effort. And in some states, there are ballot measures being proposed like Oregon. Other states have already passed some reform on the ballot like California and Arizona. And so they're working to shore up the process in their state and make sure it works well. Other states don't have the possibility of a ballot measure, and so they're taking a legislative approach. And the fourth kind of state is a state that has no possibility of getting something through the legislature, so they're suing the state in order to make changes. So, as I said, this is going on in all 50 states, and the league thinks it's important for all states to do it. And lastly, we are actually acting on our league positions. Both the National League and the Oregon League have a very strong position in favor of an independent redistricting commission, and that's what we're trying to accomplish here. So I hope that answered the question. a long-winded answer, but there's a lot to that.
Right. We have several other questions to offer. Will, if this gets on the ballot and voters approve it, will it apply to federal elections or federal seats only, or to state
Yes.
and local?
Both congressional and legislative districts will be remapped by this process.
Okay, so to clarify, this would apply to Oregon Senate, Oregon House, and congressional seats, would not
Correct.
apply at the local level.
Correct.
Correct.
Not at the county level. That's right.
Right, county or city. Another, how confident are you that, especially given the pivot that's having to happen, that we can get enough signatures to get it on the ballot?
Well, that's a hard thing to speculate. We are still trying to get on the ballot, certainly. If that doesn't happen, then we'll have to see what we do then. It may be that we have to wait another 10 years to do this. So there may be something in the meantime, like the lobbying the legislature to refer something to the voters, that could happen also. And we certainly will be putting all the pressure we can on the legislature to pass a good redistricting maps when they do get to this.
Even with the coronavirus challenges, I think that this initiative has some unique elements to it, and that's that it's very, very multi-partisan. It's a statewide effort. We've done some polling, and we really know that Oregonians support this. The main thing is just getting over that technological barrier and getting the petitions in their hands and back. And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of data of how successful that'll be because it's never really been done on a statewide level before. So we're doing everything we can. We're going to be mailing out petitions to over 50,000 US voters.
500,000.
500,000, yes. Yeah, that's way better number, my bad. And all of those are going to be high propensity, so they're going to have more than one voter in the household. And we know that those voters are going to be really active. And that's why we have the petition also available on the website for people to download and sign.
I'm going to share my screen for a moment, show you a picture of the mailing that's being prepared, if I may.
We're very excited about it.
Yeah. And I also think it's just a great exercise. Look at that.
This is some of the 500,000 mailers that are going out hopefully early next week.
I haven't even seen this picture yet. This is awesome. Have we posted this yet? We need to post this.
Yes, we do. Okay, next question.
We've got something in chat. Can you describe, and maybe multiple panelists will be able to address this, can you describe why this effort is particularly critical with the prospect of a new congressional seat given population shifts? So. Yeah,
well, I can speak to that. I mean, I think that everyone knows, and it's kind of a subject that is really upon us, and that's the idea of demographic change and the idea of the changing population and people really new groups getting involved with the political process as well. And so when we are growing like this, I think we want to make sure that we're giving people opportunity to have trust and feel like they have a place within themselves to interact with the system and actually affect it in these ways. And I think by building up these kind of structures, that gives new voters and other people a feeling like, okay, the people have a voice that is meaningful, especially when it comes to drawing these lines and whatnot. And so I think that's very important to look at that dynamic.
Well, there's a related question that we often get as to what the new districts will look like. And since there'll be 6 of them instead of 5, it's inevitable that the districts will be smaller. And it's fun to speculate as to where those lines might be. But inevitably, the 2nd congressional district that covers all of Eastern Oregon now will shrink. and probably be centered around Bend, Oregon, where a big boost in the population has occurred. And I imagine another district will be in Southern Oregon that's centered around Medford, and the other 3 or 4 districts will actually squeeze north from there in the Willamette Valley and on the coast. So that's the general outline of what I think might happen. Next question.
Could one or more of you put this in the context? So this is part of a kind of a voting rights platform. So it's redistricting is a part of it. So I wonder if you could just sort of put it in that larger context of the importance of, you know, kind of getting at what Eric was talking about is, you know, ensuring that people have access to the ballot and that we're all equal in that process.
Right. Well, when I came onto the campaign, if you don't mind, when I came onto the campaign, one of the things that intrigued me was the idea of fairness. The NAACP, we are an organization that does appeal to the federal government in most cases, because our case of racial treatment and the question around equality begins at the federal level, but it obviously, as we know from history, the states are intimately involved with that. But we feel like that at this point, having a principled national stance that all states should give their citizens the right to have this opportunity to draw districts that are fair for their brothers and sisters and neighbors. Sometimes, and I think we're trying to bring back this feeling of community and feeling of responsibility on an individual level for the nation, and giving them responsibilities of this magnitude is really a great way of doing that. And as we do this here, you know, yes, it may go up against the grain of some of the power structure if you are a Democrat or you're this or that, but it also goes against the grain of the power structure in Mississippi, Alabama, if that's the case there. What we are trying to find is balance. Balance that is representative of all people, and understanding that all people come in different degrees and whatnot, and we want our system to be balanced enough so that they all have a place in it. And so that's really where we're coming from on this national perspective of why we would do something here. We're making a message that is also hopefully being received in other areas about being a team, reciprocity, working for the nation, and with the idea that, yes, this is a long-term fight for the NAACP around discrimination and racial justice. I have right here in front of me a book talking about the voting rights guarantees that were omitted in 1964 with the Civil Rights Act. And so we're talking, and so it took a while for just guarantees and the acts. An act is not the law. So anyway, there's a long history of trying to bring people into this system. And anytime we can create avenues for that, for individuals to get involved, the better it is.
That's a great answer of an overview of an answer, Eric. More pragmatically, I think when ethnic groups and racial groups and other minorities approach the legislature during their redistricting process, they'll give you lip service as to responding to those needs and desires. However, when it comes right down to it, they're going to make their decisions that are based on creating districts that get them reelected for the most part. And that involves creating safe districts and bipartisan gerrymandering if necessary. And the minority and ethnic groups will not be really heard in that process, any process. And I think particularly the process that we propose will do a lot better than the legislature will in this respect.
Well, and I agree. When you have very hyper-partisan activities happening in the House, this is kind of where we were going, and it could go both ways. But the idea is that we are trying to create a brotherhood, sisterhood amongst the people who are on that 12-person commission, because they will not actually be there representing their party, hopefully, because there will be a process. They will be there as citizens who want to do right by this system and be as fair as they can. So it will take it out of the partisanness that exists in the House, and hopefully these will be a way for neighbors to build trust amongst each other, even across party lines, when they do good
communities of interest.
for
Yeah.
the community. Yeah.
We have a question. Has there been any coordination or modeling of the National Redistricting group that Eric Holder is heading? So any linkage there?
Eric Holder's group is a democratically led group. We have not really been in contact with them or cooperated with them. Recently, however, I have noticed that Eric Holder and Arnold Schwarzenegger got together and have agreed to cooperate, and we'll see what effect that has when we get down into the campaign, I think. So there is some multi-partisanship involved here that I think will come through eventually.
We have several questions in the question box. Does the current efficiency gap give an advantage to Democrats in Oregon right now?
Yes.
Yes.
So the current efficiency gap gives us one extra Democratic congressional seat. So the efficiency gap was, I believe, 16 point something, and reformers recommend that it be at 7 or below.
Building on that, to that competitiveness, how do you draw districts to promote competitiveness in a state with a severe urban-rural divide?
I think that's a great question. And I think that's also why we say to the extent practicable, because we have to recognize that some communities, because of where they are geographically and their communities of interest, are going to have more of one party than another. And we want to respect a lot of those. And that's why redistricting is so complex, because we want districts to be competitive, but we also want them to be adherent to geographic boundaries that would keep people from being able to communicate. But we also want them to all be from the same community, right? And not force people who obviously don't have the same ideals to all be in one district. And so there's all of these different things that need to be considered when thinking about how can we create the most transparent, fair, and equitable districts possible that represent voters.
And I think that some of the considerations going into that are, you know, who we're talking about. So it's not just a given that the rural and the cities, that there's this complete divide and they're not anything alike. Can't buy that, because folks move back and forth. They have folks, they live there. So the reality is that I think what we're talking about is income. I mean, there are people who are rural, whose income level is someone in the city who's a high income. They're rural, high income. They have similarities. Rural people who are living in poverty and and urban people who are living in poverty have very much similarities. I mean, so I think that really when we really start to break down some of these things that have divided us and look at what our interests are, and how when we do these processes, that we do them fairly, understanding those type of realities and breaking down as many walls as we can.
I think there's also spaces in Oregon where we really could have more competitive districts. So for instance, I live in Marion, I live in Salem, and Salem, when I moved here, I was like, wow, this is a lot more competitive than I thought. And I think it could be more competitive. There is a real strong base of both parties I've seen, and I think it could be a very competitive space, and it's already considered to be one of the more competitive races in Oregon. And so I think that we have some opportunities to make some districts more competitive than they are due to safe districts that are currently being drawn.
So let's face it, there are some places in the state, like in the metropolitan Portland area, that will probably always be Democrat. And there's other parts of the state in Eastern Oregon that will always be Republican or leaning that way. but there's a vast area in the middle, particularly the Willamette Valley and the coast, that could be competitive and choose different things to choose their politicians on. So that's why we're working on this. This is also why this is a inherently human process that has to balance all these subjective parameters that is balancing out competitiveness with communities of interest and safe districts that are drawn to represent minority groups and so on. So all these different factors have to be balanced out by a set of 12 humans, and it's also why it can't be done by computers.
I have a mechanical question.
Yeah.
So so there's this big mail out that's going to go. People can also email the campaign or go to the website. This is a little bit different. Is it possible to develop a posting that people could send out to different groups like neighborhood associations and churches so that more groups can work to get their members to sign petitions?
Yes, you would email me. So I'm going to give you my campaign email. One thing I forgot to mention, which is actually really important, and I need to mention before I end this, is that I'm actually leaving the league at the end to really spend efforts on the campaign side. And so I have a campaign email that I'll share with you. I'm also the one that actually answers the sign at email. So you'll be hearing from me. But basically, I have these petition packets with 10 and 5 lines, instructions on how to do that. And we can work on a cover sheet and some other letter type formats that really tell people what this is. We're working on some more informational sheets for volunteers who want to help gather, but want like maybe a summary of what redistricting even is, right? Because they don't know how to explain that like I just did. Right. And so those are all resources that I can share with you. And I'll go ahead and leave my email in the chat, but I'll also give you my email when I follow up with you all via after this webinar.
Let's see. Okay, so we've got 2 people who've posed something very similar. And I don't know if it's really possible to answer this, but I will crunch their 2 comments / questions down, which has to do with, we're looking at this as a nonpartisan way of making it fair. What I'm sensing in these 2 different postings is we're in an era where one party is using voter suppression. And so is this a good idea? So for instance, one, is curbing the current Democratic advantage a good idea in an era when the GOP engages, blah, blah, blah. So there's that. Another person posed something similar but longer. So I don't know if it's possible to answer that. It's more of an opinion.
Yeah. I mean,
yeah.
I would answer that, you know.
Okay.
I agree, you know, and it's a difficult issue. And that's why before we were talking about the idea of principles.
Yes.
We're trying to set at this point contrast against the current type of leadership we see and the current type of division we see. And at some point, and this is just me and the NAACP, I think we would like to have balance and a fortitude with what we think is right. And if it means that in a state such as Oregon, where we do have democratic control and we do have power in that way, that even they within that time could see reaching out and giving a little bit of consideration as a way moving forward. And like I said, and the idea is that we want to have national leadership of that type. And we're gonna, and this is just voting rights, and we're talking about that. And I understand the power loss, but what is the gain? The gain, what we're trying to do is we're trying to gain trust with the people that we have to actually legislate with and actually live with and raise our children with, going forward and combat COVID-19 with going forward. And we need to stop the division as best we can. And whenever we can take a high road, and it may be in some way hurt a little or not. I don't know. That's not a given. But the thing is, I think we have to do that on principle at this stage, and sometimes it may not seem logical, but I don't think. But it depends on what is your goals if it's purely political. One of the things that I say is about being politically correct and that whole idea of political correctness. I think the whole idea about putting all our bag in political jargon and parties and all that in many ways has been a trick, especially when it comes to Black folks, because the whole idea of racial justice and ending Black oppression in the United States of America in some ways has been turned into this idea of, oh, you're being politically correct. And at what point did Martin Luther King or anybody else talk about what they were saying as a political question? When the Supreme Court answered the Civil Rights and the Voting Rights Act and Brown versus the Board of Education, these were not political questions, really. These were moral questions about the humanity and soul of our nation. So that's kind of what we're talking about. We have to, in some way, embody that and move forward, even if it's in principle.
So Kelly, I'm hearing in that question what I would call the unilateral disarmament argument. And let me just say this, that since the League is working in every state on this issue, we're not looking to unilaterally disarm. We're looking to give back to the voters their control over their government. And when legislators create districts, safe districts for themselves, the voters don't have hardly any control. And as it is now, something like 95% of incumbents get reelected. And when there's no possibility of changing your representation, then there's no control of the voters of their government. So we're trying to shift that towards the voters, let the voters decide who their representatives are so that they can have more accountability in their government.
A different question around nonpartisanship. So the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization, and there may be others on this webinar similarly situated. Give us some guidance about how we talk about this campaign so that we're doing it in a nonpartisan way.
Yeah, I think that the way that I've done it is really recognizing that gerrymandering is done by anyone in leadership. It's really hard to give up power when you're in power. And what Norman said is true in most states where voters are coming together in coalitions and advocating for reform. The people who are mainly opposing it are the people who are in power of the redistricting process. And those people are our legislators. They're the people who are able at this point in a lot of states, over 30 of them still, that are drawing their own districts. And that makes it so that people are not able to pick their politicians. Politicians are picking them. And we don't think that that's fair. And so that's the way that I explain kind of what the real big problem is in the nation, really, and why gerrymandering is done. I explain how the League, if you're coming from a League perspective, I usually say, the League supports redistricting reform because we support fair, transparent processes that give voters back their power. I would explain it like that. From a nonpartisan perspective, this would help all parties. This would help all voters. This is a chance for people, not politicians, to be drawing the maps.
I'm not seeing other questions in the chat box or in the Q&A box. I am seeing a request that we once again share the League's petition link. And so we can do a going, gone, but certainly before we sign out, maybe if each of the three of you have closing remarks, that would be really helpful in terms of where we stand and what's next.
Well, maybe I'll start off. to add to an answer to that previous question, the League is nonpartisan, but nonpartisan doesn't mean apolitical. We are certainly a political organization, and this is a process issue of redistricting. And as a process issue, it's like a double-edged sword that can cut both ways, and it often does. And to use another euphemism, the shoe can be on the other foot at any time and has been in the past. It's not a Democratic or a Republican issue. It's a hyper-partisan issue that we're trying to get at. And we're trying to reduce that hyper-partisanship so that the voters win in the process. I think we can successfully do this. We've got a three-pronged initiative signature gathering plan mapped out for the next 6 weeks or so. The prongs are the ones that we've been talking about, the direct mail to 500,000 registered voter households. And we think we can probably get about 100,000 signatures out of that mailing. The next second part is emailing to all the constituent organization that are part of the coalition. There's about 100,000 households there that we think we can get maybe 50,000 signatures out of. And that together is the 150,000 signatures that we need. But we also need signatures to cover the invalid and ruined petitions. So we'll probably need another 50,000, and that's where the street petitioning will come in when we are able to get that far. So anything you can do now is the time. It's time for everybody to go into emergency mode and get those signatures.
Yeah.
Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, well, I just think that this is a great opportunity during this COVID-19. We're all kind of sequestered, but this is a movement that can you can get involved with. You can pass the word out there, and we can really see how we can do something innovative as far as this trying to do this petition and the way we are doing it. So I think it's kind of exciting. It's kind of people power if we can get it done. I think going forward, hopefully this won't be something we're dealing with for much longer or that long. But the more that we can show that this type of thing is viable, the better. So I would just encourage everybody to get involved with the process. I just looked at our website and realized that we don't have the link up right now. It's an event for this event, but we will shortly have on the NAACP Lane County website a link to the petition as well. And I'm sorry that's not up there right now. But yeah, I just had a good time being here, and thank you for hosting this.
I really appreciate everyone for coming today. Just so you all know, this session has been recorded. So I will be sending the recording to all of you all, as well as to the people who couldn't make it today. And I'll be giving the recording to our participants here today who joined us so that they can share it with their members who weren't able to make it today to share these resources. So, oh, thank you, Alicia, for saying that. So I just wanted to say thank you so much. I really appreciated this. And I shared my email in the chat. I will also be following up with you all just to make sure you have the petition, that I can answer any questions of how you can spread the word to your members. And I wish you all safety, and I wish you all health during this time. And even if things are opening up, I hope that you stay home for a little longer, because I want you to stay healthy.
And I want to add one thing as well, is we're talking about statewide redistricting reform that would affect congressional seats, how we draw boundaries for congressional seats and the state legislative districts. And just want to remind those who are still on this webinar that redistricting happens at multiple levels. And I strongly encourage you to pay attention to the redistricting that's going to be going on, whether you live in Douglas County or Lane County or another county at the county level, as well as with your local city governments, because all of that has an impact in our daily lives as well.
Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you all for joining us. Thanks, Eric. Thanks, Norman. Thanks, Candelin.
Good night,
Well,
everyone.
Good night.
Good night.